Welcome to the podcast. Súbele volumen. Conversation with the people who were with me. In the world of TV. Carlos tonight. Carlos tonight. Historias de un reportero. Carlos tonight. Carlos tonight. Dale que viene lo bueno.
Hey everybody, welcome to Carlos Tonight. Thank you so much for watching and for listening. I really appreciate it. This week, we're diving into the world of imagination, mystery, and storytelling with my special guest, Ali Kaden. He's the author of a series of books, including The Past Awakens, Ritual, Dyeworks, and A Memory of Tomorrow. These are great books that mix history, mystery, and self-discovery. They are thrilling adventures that will keep the pages turning. Ali, thank you so much for joining me. Welcome to Carlos Tonight.
Thank you so much, Carlos. It's great to be here.
All right. Before we dive in, can you share with the audience a little bit about the genre that you're part of, and the books that you write?
Sure. I started out writing paranormal thrillers. I had been a big Stephen King fan growing up, and when I decided that I was going to dive into fiction, I picked that as the main genre. And I was very expansive in my application of it. As you mentioned, there's some historical references, there's some fantastical elements. But the thing that stays consistent in all my writing is that there's a thriller suspense element and there's a lot of action.
Wonderful. Let's start with asking this question. How long did the idea for your book series, for example, how long did it live in your head before you actually wrote it down on a piece of paper and created what we note of today?
Well, the book series didn't live in my head very long because once I decided to write it, I wrote. But the desire to be a writer, I can remember being 5 or 6 years old and reading stories with my mom and thinking, wow, being a writer and making other people feel things with your words is incredible. And I wanted to be a writer. And in college, in undergrad, I studied creative writing, English literature. And since that time, I dabbled in fiction, but I never finished anything until 2019. So it took me maybe 15 years from writing my first word to publishing something, about 15 years, unfortunately.
Oh, okay. I feel similar to you, where I'll start something and not finish it. What was your motivation to actually finishing a project?
During COVID, we were all locked up at home, and I think a lot of people started writing during COVID, which is an interesting trend, and I'm the same. And I work in real estate. That's my day job is in real estate, and so I wanted to write a book about the particular niche that I'm in real estate, and I started writing that and published it, and really loved self-publishing and the process and working with an editor and finishing a book. And I said, this is great, I want to do it again. And then I wrote a fitness book, and those under my real name. Ali Kaden is a pen name. And after I published that second fitness book, I realized that I was being a little bit cowardly and that my true passion was to write fiction, and that I was just writing this nonfiction as because I didn't want to lean fully on my creativity and my ideas. And once I realized that, I was like, okay, let's do this.
That's awesome. Ali, how do you develop each of your characters? Are they based on anyone in real life, anyone in particular?
No. I would say that parts of my personality end up in characters, and I've written each book very differently. The first one, before I wrote the first one, I read Stephen King's On Writing, and he talks about writing situationally, where you pick a situation and then zoom out from there. So somebody's stuck in a room, somebody's banging on the door, how do you get out? He just starts there and doesn't plot, just sees where the scenes take him. So I wrote my first book that way. And so I would say that a lot of the characters are manifestations of my subconscious. In books 2 and 3 of that series, I plotted a little bit more and created characters that foreshadow and represent some of the themes that I was trying to present in the novel.
What is it about your book series that resonate with the readers, you think?
I would say that they like the action scenes. That's one thing that readers have often said, that they like the action scenes that I write. Another comment that is somewhat frequent is the reader feels taken care of, for lack of a better way of saying it. I have a way of writing that informs the reader just enough about what's happening in a given scene so that they're present with what's happening and they don't get lost in the details. It's not cryptic. It's a very gentle read for somebody to follow along and know what's happening.
Okay. Um, my my love for storytelling began in fourth grade in a classroom in Chicago. Where do you remember where your first that moment where you decided, writing is something that I would want to do as a career?
What comes to mind is when I was a child, I remember reading two books. One was Aesop's Fables, which I loved, and the other was A Wrinkle in Time. And after reading those two books, I just felt very called to write, and I love the idea that I could put words down on paper and somebody else could read them and they could feel. And really, like I traced the spark of the desire to write, but similar to what you just shared, in the third grade in Mrs. Johnson's class, we would have these free writing assignments, and we would just sit and everybody would create their own stories, and I loved that. And I was really big into WWF wrestling at the time. I was in third grade,
Yeah.
and there was a wrestler back then called the Ultimate Warrior. He was all muscly and he had face paint and long hair, and so I wrote stories about the Ultimate Warrior fighting and beating everybody up, and I would read these stories out loud to my peers in the classroom, and they would love them. So that was my first taste of being an author. I wrote these stories and read them out loud to my friends, and they loved it.
That's awesome. Do you ever sit down and kind of think about your skills as a storyteller and how they develop from that classroom to now?
I do. I think about that a lot. My first book, and I think this is true with a lot of authors, they throw the kitchen sink at it. They put all their skills, all their metaphors, all their beautiful turns of phrase in that first book. And I did that. And then when I progressed with the series, I focused a little bit more on plot and progression and a little bit less on flowery language. I think of the book The Alchemist often when I write. The Alchemist by Paulo Coelho. It was written in Portuguese. It's been translated into almost every language. It's a very short book. I think it's 38,000 words, something like that, not very long. And it's very, very simple. The narrative style is very simple, but it's one of the best-selling books of all time, and it moves so many people. So I keep that as a guiding principle, that in this day and age where everything is fast and we consume content and we want things to be to consume things in an efficient manner, I try to write books that are easy to digest versus pulling out all my Shakespearean tricks.
Nice. Okay. Something interesting, I think the viewers and listeners would like to know is your background. You grew up in between Egypt and New York, right? Tell us about that.
My family immigrated to the US in the 80s, in the early 80s, and I was born in New York City. And I grew up thinking that I was always going to live in New York City, and my family's Egyptian. When I was 12, my father decided that he wanted to move back to Egypt. So we're sort of a reverse immigration story, where he packed it up and he said, I want to go back home. I'm going to start a company there, and I want my son to learn the language and the religion. He wanted me to be fluent in Arabic. He didn't want me to lose the culture living in the US, and he had some career aspirations. So and but we visited the U.S. very often. I would often come to the U.S. in the summer to New York, and so that started a trend of just back and forth, back and forth. I did a bit of high school there in Egypt, and then a bit of high school with a study abroad in the U.S., and then I came to the U.S. for college in Seattle, and then I went back to Egypt and worked there for a little under a decade, and then I moved back to the U.S. and moved to Boston. So it's always been a back and forth, and culturally, I identify very much with a term called third culture kid, which is people who are raised between two cultures and they tend to identify with both or neither. You know, if I'm not fully Egyptian and I'm not fully American, I'm sort of this gray area thing in the middle. That's its own thing, and that's how I think of myself.
Are there aspects of your culture that you include in any of your novels?
My pen name, Ali Kaden, Ali is my real first name, but Kaden, I picked it because it's right next to King and Kuntz in the bookstore on the shelf. But Kaden in Arabic, Kaden means friend. So I used a little bit of Arabic wording to pick my pen name. And in every book that I've written, almost every book that I've written, the characters talk about Egypt or visit Egypt. They're more connected to ancient Egypt than modern Egypt, which is totally different. You know, the ancient world, the temples, hieroglyphics, pyramids, all that stuff. I draw upon that mythology a lot in all the books I've written, or most of the books I've written, even though those books do not necessarily take place in Egypt.
Okay. Is food a big thing in your culture like it is in mine? And do you include any of that?
No, I don't think I've written about any Arabic food. I have a character in the first series that's Romanian, and I did that just randomly. It just felt right. And so I looked into Romanian food and drink and expressions and added that. So instead of going Egyptian, I went Romanian for some reason.
Gotcha. Okay. So when you started writing the Past Awakens, did you know it was going to be a book series? Did you know part 2 and part 3?
Sort of. I did a little bit of reading about self-publishing and what the industry is like and what's most likely to be commercially viable. And from what I read, picking genre fiction, something that's trending and popular, like paranormal thriller. Another piece of advice is to write serialized fiction, with the idea being that once you write a book, you start, or a few books, you start running ads, and people will buy book 1, and then they'll like the series and go on to buy book 2 and book 3 and etc. And that is what's needed for the economics to make sense for somebody to be commercially viable. So I knew that I knew that I wanted to write serialized fiction, and it was also a challenge to commit to writing 3 books before I had finished the first one. And so I did know that it was going to be a series.
Okay. If someone out there hasn't read your books, how do they tie in with each other, or do they?
The Past Awakens, they all take place or that series takes place in Massachusetts, and it's based on a fictional town, Bainford, but it's based on real Massachusetts towns. And I use a little bit of the Salem witch trial history and that sort of stuff in the book. That in the book 1 is where the 2 main characters meet, and then in book 2 and 3 they're an official duo that are battling paranormal threats. Those books are self-contained in that world. I have a standalone novel that takes place in Calcutta, India, and that's completely separate. And then I'm working on a new series that has a Middle Eastern character, and the first book does take place in Egypt, and so I'm drawing more of my own culture and experiences into what I'm working on now.
I gotcha. Okay. What's one thing that you want readers to walk away with from picking up either this series of books or the other standalone books that you have?
Well, I've shifted a little bit in what I'm writing. It still has the thriller, suspense, action elements, but I've sort of replaced paranormal with esoteric spiritual. So I love reading about ancient cultures and ancient history, and I love learning about religion and all the various spiritual and shamanic traditions in the world. And so I write in a way that elevates all these religions and spiritual paths as being equal. And that's something that matters a great deal to me: interfaith communication and mutual respect between religious and spiritual traditions. So that's one thing that I think people could find in the book, my books, is that it will, if a religion or a spiritual tradition is mentioned, it is mentioned with the same grace and appreciation that others are mentioned, that nothing is elevated above the other.
Wonderful. Tell me, Ali, if somebody out there is wanting to perhaps follow in your footsteps and start self-publishing or writing books, where do they go? What advice would you give them?
I would read Stephen King's book on writing. I thought that was a great guide for authors getting started on their journey. And he's not self-published, obviously, but he talks about the mechanics of writing, not only language, but also word count. Stephen King is very prolific, and he's written so many books, and people have always awed at how are you able to produce this many books? And in his book on writing, he just says, I write 1,000 words a day. And if you do that in 3 months, you'll have a 90,000 word book. And that made it seem so simple, this giant novel that seems impossible to finish. All I have to do is write 1,000 words a day. And so that's what I would tell authors, a daily consistent practice. You don't have to write it all in one go. It doesn't have to be this long, grueling process, just a little bit every day. And if they're going to go the self-published route, there are some resources online. I would say a Facebook group, 20 Books to 50K, is a great resource for self-published authors. There's a lot of authors either just starting out or very established that are making hundreds of thousands and even millions from their books. And they talk about their writing process, how long it takes, but also the editing and the cover design and the marketing and the other aspects that go into the business side of things.
I'm curious. I read somewhere where, people are always like planning. I want to do this. I want to do this with a book or write about this. And it gets stuck in their head. And basically someone says, just sit down and start writing. Is that something that like you mentioned about Stephen King writing, 1,000 pages or 1,000 words a day? Is that something you do when you're writing a book?
Yes. When I'm writing a book, I track the word count that I add every day. It makes me feel good. And sometimes it's a little under 1,000, sometimes it's more than 1,000, but I keep track of it. And then once the manuscript is finished, I usually go through it 2 or 3 times editing. And then it's not so much about word count. It's more about getting a chapter edited in record time. I'm always trying to beat my record. I'm playing all these games with myself. So let's say that I tend to have a little bit longer chapters. So if I have a book that's 15 chapters, I'll set a goal of I'm going to edit a chapter a day. And I usually fail. I usually don't, some chapters take a couple of days, especially if I have a part that's a little bit, writing isn't buttoned up yet, it'll take longer, but I have that as a goal. So when I finish a book, I'm like, I'm 2 weeks away from being done. If I can edit a chapter every day, I aim for it, but I don't hit that often.
Gotcha. Okay. You can find your books on Amazon and Barnes and Noble and online. Tell us where else we can find your books.
I have a website, alikadenbooks.com. All my links are there to Instagram, Facebook, TikTok. I would say that's the best way to find me, is either on Amazon or on social media.
Awesome. I'm going to go get your books and read them and let you know what I think about them. And I'm
Please,
sure they're great.
Thank you, Carlos.
Awesome. Ali, thank you so much for spending a little bit of time with me today on my show. I appreciate it. Continued success. God bless you.
God bless you. Thank you for having me on.
And that's all the time we have. Thanks so much for watching and for listening. I really appreciate it. Remember, you can check out my website, carlostonight.com. There you can find the latest on the podcast, see past episodes, and check out upcoming guests. That's carlostonight.com. We'll see you next time.